south of the border, down Mexico way. That's where I fell in love when the stars above came out to play. And now as I wander...
Hello there, all you expat wannabes. I'm Johnny Mueller, and you're listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America, the show that tells you just what it's like to live, work, play, and or retire down here in Latin America. It's a mix of the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, and it's all right here, so let's get started.
Hey, now, here's something you don't read about in the mainstream news. That's why I like reading these Latin American newspapers. However, they're almost always in Spanish, so I'm certain probably not even 1 in 1,000 gringos and expats ever bothers to read them. And the funny thing is, in every gringoized area in Latin America, even slightly gringoized area, there'll be some gringo English language rags too. They're almost always free giveaways in coffee shops, hotels, and travel agencies. As Expat Eddie says, they're okay for tourists and newbies, but for long-term expats, they're only worth reading on the crapper. They always do have a little spot of news, though it's always gringo news. Happy, touristy gringo news. After all, they're free, and why do you think they're free? Because advertisers pay for it, and advertisers live by and for tourism. So, that's why you're not going to get too much dirt in your usual suspect English-speaking gringo rag. Oh, and some of them are really cutesy. They'll have 1 page in Spanish and 1 page in English. But do you think any gringos or expats read the Spanish side? No way, man. Unless, of course, you're going to Spanish school, and that's one of your assignments from the teacher. All right, then how about this? And I know you haven't heard this before. Did you know that since Ecuador weaseled out and turned over Julian Assange, it's been a couple months now, right? Well, Ecuadorian government websites have been hit with, get this, 40,000 cyber attacks and malicious hacks. Man, I'll tell you what, the Ecuadorian government is really suffering right now. Websites are corrupted, some sites are down, and all that tends to do is to slow down even more the government processing of useless paperwork, which, like with every government agency in Latin America, is normally at a snail's pace and on double mañana time anyway. So, in effect, what you've got with Latin businesses and commerce is mañana time, and when you're dealing with government, double mañana time. You got it? So wouldn't you think that when the Ecuadorian government released Assange that they just might be getting some blowback? And when it comes to website hacks and sabotage, they are no match for first world libertarian type computer nerds. And there are a lot of them out there. Anyway, the point is the government is suffering, which means if you're a gringo or expat living in Ecuador or visiting there and have to do any kind of business with the government, get any paperwork, titles, land deeds, driver's licenses, residency, whatever, be prepared to sit on your dead ass well beyond double mañana time. Now, as for me, I think the Ecuadorian government was completely blindsided by that. They never would think that far ahead. I mean, does any government have that kind of vision? As my deceased but brilliant Uncle Bernie used to say, in every college graduation class, there's the top 10% and the bottom 10%. And that bottom 10% has a hard time making it in the private sector, unless, of course, they enter a profession where their daddies or mommies own the business. So where do they end up? In government or teaching? Same thing. And though there are always exceptions to the rule, they usually end up being expert space occupiers, chair sitters, and paper pushers. So then what about the ones that make it to the top? Well, that's easily explained. We all know that big government, in a way, is like a gigantic septic tank. It's simply a law of physics that the biggest turds float to the top. But back to Ecuador. So why do you think they released Julian Assange? Well, of course, to suck up to the U.S. and world-class bankers. But how do we know that? Where's the proof? Here's the proof. Did you know that 2 weeks after Assange was turned over, they got a $40 million IMF loan and a huge $100 million grant, free money, from your Uncle Sam. And that came just a week later. On top of that, just 3 weeks later, a huge contingency of human blood clots, otherwise known as U.S. congressmen, came down to Ecuador on a gift-giving mission. Yep, freebies for everyone. No strings attached, right? And the topper to prove that the Ecuadorian government is permanently attached to Uncle Sam's anal sphincter? Well, it's just been announced this week that the United States Agency for International Development, that's USAID, will reestablish its headquarters in Quito following a 5-year absence. The agency, as it turns out, which had operated in Ecuador for decades, was expelled in 2014 by former President Correa. Now, as for me, I think that was one of the only positive things that Rafael Correa did. Kick out USAID because, just look it up on Wikipedia. It's supposedly a wholly owned U.S.-operated humanitarian agency, but it's really a cover for CIA and NSA. Look it up. So hats off to Korea for kicking him out 5 years ago, but guess what? One of the components in the secret back deal to turn over Assange was huge IMF and other bailouts because the Ecuadorian government is virtually bankrupt. That, of course, due to Korea and his cronies. So, the new president, Moreno, invited all the slimy tentacles of the U.S. government back in. Oh, and of course, the PR machines are doing great spin work, even praising the fact that Ecuador has invited USAID back into the country. Just look at the evidence in this BS press release. It says, John Barsek, U.S. Deputy for Latin American and Caribbean Affairs, said Friday that he had reached an agreement with Ecuador's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to resume operations with the signing of a letter of understanding because we're entering a new era of bilateral cooperation between Ecuador and the U.S. and are looking forward to resuming projects that satisfy our mutual interests. Yeah, right. We applaud Ecuador's recent democratic reforms. Yada, yada, yada. And what he should have said was, the truth is that this and all the dough that we're handing you is in appreciation for turning over Julian Assange, the biggest pain in the ass the NSA, the CIA, FBI, and the U.S. military has ever seen. Meanwhile, looking back, this is what ex-President Correa said when he kicked him out of the country 5 years ago. He said in a televised press conference that USAID was no longer welcome in Ecuador. Because although it claims to promote projects that benefit our people, the agency is actually serving as an espionage branch of the U.S. and has a proven history of influencing governments to do its bidding. Meanwhile, now that Ecuador has become kind of a U.S. satellite, Ecuador's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Augusto Sa, said last Friday that we are looking forward to a new era of cooperation with the U.S. government through USAID projects. Oh man, is that not reason enough to scratch Ecuador off your Plan B list? Now, for my money, the big reason the U.S. government and USAID wanted back into Ecuador was because Ecuador's a net oil exporter. You need look no further for an explanation. If a country is exporting oil or has big reserves, the U.S. wants in. Just check it out. Do a little reading. You'll find that the countries that have no oil get no aid. The countries with oil, the U.S. is all over them. Now, if you happen to be a super patriot and a goody two-shoes, you might say it's all in the name of helping underdeveloped countries. But here's what you didn't know. For the record, the U.S. has overthrown at least one democracy and installed at least one dictator in every single country in Central and South America in the last 100 years, except for the Dutch territory of Curaçao. Again, look it up, and then you can tell me about the nobility of U.S. motives. Is it any wonder that Ecuador is one of only 3 out of 20 countries in Latin America that uses the U.S. dollar as its official currency? Now, as for me, if I was king for a day, the first thing I'd do, well, maybe not the first thing. All right, the second or third thing I'd do would be to give Julian Assange a Nobel Prize. On second thought, now that Obama has one, that would be kind of an insult, so I take it back. But you know, there is a silver lining to all this. Talk about how the U.S. gets involved in every country that exports oil. Well, with solar and renewable power coming on so strong and fast, with electric cars and trucks poised to take over the entire transportation industry in probably only 10 years, oil, of course, will still be important for synthetics and plastics, etc., but it'll be relegated to a simple commodity, like copper, aluminum, or corn, and nothing worth starting a war over. I mean, who ever heard of a copper war, or a tin war, or aluminum war, or a corn war? Well, maybe way back when the Mayans and the Aztecs ripped each other's hearts out, fighting wars for corn. Anyway, you get the idea. Then again, very soon there might come a time when we have water wars. But that's a completely different subject. All right, speaking of scaling down dependence on oil, I've got this email from Davey. Can't believe it, another Dave. I'll tell you, in my experience, guys named Dave are the most email-writingest individuals, but that's a good thing. Anyway, this email from Davey says, Hey, Johnny, I've been thinking about your idea for a portable solar backup. I believe you said you would email details to anyone requesting it, for how to build such a unit, where to order parts, etc., etc. You also spoke about new batteries that are smaller, more powerful, and efficient, which sounds very interesting. My question is, will a setup like this operate an entire house with AC included, say for a day or two? And is there a simple calculation that could deduce the battery power reservoir needed on a per-day basis for such a system? That is, in case, for some reason, you could not access your solar charging panels. Then he says, I think if you could last 24 to 48 hours without the panels, that would be without sun or maybe during a continuous rainstorm. That would suffice for most outages. Thanks, Johnny. Signed, Davey. Oh, and while we're talking about solar, I might as well read this email. It comes from Horatio. All right, so Horace says, I've been listening and enjoying your podcast for the past 2 years or so. Being an electrical engineer myself, I have particularly loved your series on solar panels, etc. You did an outstanding job, and I hope you keep producing technically oriented shows. Your information is priceless, and I'm working on my Plan B too, hoping to persuade my wife to come on board. I also would appreciate if you could send me the portable water filter details you mentioned on a recent show. I really look forward to every Friday and Sunday release of your podcast. Regards, Horatio. Well, there you have it, folks. Not a lot of Horatios around. I bet he got his ass kicked a lot as a kid. Why do parents do those things? Anyway, the reason why I wanted to read that email was that I wanted you to hear that email coming from another electrical engineer who sort of reinforces the fact that we're giving out some really good information. He calls it priceless, but that'd be stretching it just a little, especially since you get what you pay for. But then again, maybe when he says priceless, it's a play on words because if it's free, the price is zero. And zero means nothing, which means priceless. Oh yeah, you gotta love the English language, huh? Man, speaking of language, I got to tell you, the Spanish language is in no way as flexible as the English language, especially when it comes to simple or complex double entendres, like that little bit of wordplay we just went through. You just can't spin things like that in the Spanish language, sorry. Or maybe it's just that the people in the Spanish culture aren't that creative with their language, because, man, I can tell you so many times when I try to spin their language like that, make it funny or clever, like you might do in English, I get these looks, amusing looks, and sometimes I'll even get a chuckle out of them. But I know, without a doubt, they never really heard anyone screw and twist with their language like that, which makes me wonder all the time, why don't they do it? For example, in the Spanish language, there's no such thing as a pun. Not in the kind of goofy sense we've honed them and perfected them. To us, a pun is kind of a goofy play on words. Sometimes clever, mostly stupid. Now, in Spanish, there is a word for pun, retrocano, but the meaning doesn't really qualify as what we know as a pun. Their word for pun, retrocano, is defined as a word that has two different meanings, one contradicting the other. But in English, we know a pun is much more flexible and malleable than that. You get the drift, right? Speaking of drift and drifting, that's another way of saying digressing, isn't it? And man, did I drift. I mean, digress. All right, where were we? Oh, yeah. Talking about Davy's points about solar. His first question, will a portable solar system be able to back up an entire house, including AC? The answer is no, Davy. Ideally, you want two systems. A portable system with a couple of suitcase solar panels you can just toss in your car, your truck, and drive away with, or set up in your driveway or backyard in 5 or 10 minutes. And with that, you've got enough power for the basics around the house, but it only lasts you a couple hours, maybe maximum 8 hours. Your portable system, an all-in-one system, will have a handle on it. You can just carry it around. And what will it power up? Well, think about what the basics are around your house. Certainly your refrigerator, computer, TV, monitor, and lights for sure. And if you're in Latin America living in low altitude or on or near the beach, you want to have a nice, maybe 50 to 100 watt fan because it won't power your AC. You know, the purpose of a portable solar system is really just to be there in case you have an outage for a couple of hours. Or if you're out in the boonies, in a cabin, or hiking, or on a hunting trip, or even if you head out on a boat or out to the beach for an afternoon, a portable system's perfect. But for around the home, it's basically an emergency unit, not meant to run your whole house for a continuous period of time. However, because you'll have a couple of solar panels, that means when the sun's out, your unit will get recharged for the evening, and while you've got sunlight on the panels, it can run that limited amount of appliances too. Now, what's really cool about the latest and greatest portable units is that if you don't have a lot of dough and you want to start out small, you can just buy the solar unit without the panels. Get the panels later. Say, what? Johnny, you need panels, don't you? Well, that's the beauty of it. You see, with the newer units, and the one I have and recommend, you can plug it right into your wall outlet and it'll charge right up that way without the panels. And of course, if you use panels, it'll get charged by the sunlight too. That means even without panels, it's always charged up in case of an emergency. Of course, if you don't have panels and you throw it in your car and let's say go to the beach and you're running your computer, charging a few phones, and maybe even powering up one of those tiny electric coolers. You ever see one of those? They're very cool. Pun intended. Hey, there you go, huh? The one I recommend is the size of a standard Coleman cooler. You know, the ones you take to a tailgate party? But it's a true refrigerator too, so it always remains cool. Of course, you got to supply electricity to it, and that would be your portable solar generator. But you see, that particular cooler that I recommend only uses something like 50 watts. And you know, when something's rated at any kind of wattage, that means how many watts it uses per hour. So let's do some third grade math here. Suppose you have one of those coolers, you're at the beach, it uses 50 watts an hour. And you've got the portable solar unit that I actually have. It's rated at 1200 watts when it's fully charged, but you never really discharge it all the way, maybe down to 80%. So let's say you got 1000 watts and your cooler is using 50 watts. Well, divide 50 into 1000 to see how many hours you can run that cooler before your little solar generator unit's completely kaput. We're assuming now you didn't bring your solar panels with you. You brought the unit with you already charged. All right, 50 into 1000, that's 20 hours. And how long are you going to be at the beach? 4, 5, 6 hours? Plenty to spare, right? Oh, and if you haul the suitcase solar panels with you, in my case, I've got 2 suitcase panels rated at 200 watts each when the sun's shining. That's 400 watts per hour. That means if you've got panels and the sun's shining, your 50-watt little refrigerator cooler is running completely off the sun. It's not even taking any power from the lithium-ion batteries in your portable unit. All right, let's do some calculations. If you got the little portable unit at your house and there's a power outage, you're going to plug in your refrigerator first, right? And that's probably going to use about 100 watts an hour. Most likely a lot less, though, because it's turning off and on and never runs continuously. But let's highball it and say 100 watts an hour. All right, let's say you got your laptop plugged in and a big monitor, or 40 or 50-inch TV. You're probably looking at another 100 watts per hour. Let's say you got a couple of lights plugged in and you're using those LED lights. You've got 5 of them at 10 watts apiece. That's 50 watts. So we're probably talking about a power outage at night because we're using lights. Anyway, if you add that up, 100 watts for the refrigerator, 100 watts for the monitor and laptop computer, 50 watts for the lights, that's 250 watts per hour. It's always per hour. And you've got them all plugged into the little portable solar power unit, and it's night, so your portable solar panels may be connected, but they're not working. Well, as mentioned previously, it's a 1,000-watt unit. Actually rated for more, but we're talking about 80% of its rated maximum of around 1,200 watts. So let's do the moron math. 1,000 watts divided by 250. That means you can run all 4 of those things. The lights, the monitor, the laptop, the refrigerator for 4 hours. Now, I don't know your situation up there in Cleveland or Seattle. Your grid power probably never goes down, or only during a storm for a little while. But just wait, we're talking about now, these days. We're looking at a pretty dismal future where it's a guarantee that power outages are going to be the norm. Because, you know, on every socio-economic and environmental level, things are getting worse, not better. So that's what you can look forward to up by you. However, down here in Latin America, we get our power outages. Sometimes 20 seconds, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes half an hour. But rarely, and I mean rarely, does the power ever go off for more than a half an hour. Unless, of course, it's a big storm and a tree fell on a transformer, who knows. Then you could be without power for a half a day. But still, that might only happen once or twice a year. But those small, momentarily irritating power outages are happening, well, in some cases once, twice, even 3 times a week, depending where you are. And also it's very much dependent on whether your Latin country has privatized their electrical grid or the government still runs it. Because it's always true, when it's privatized, the electricity might be a little more expensive, but the power outages are small and not very memorable. So what would you rather have? Really cheap electricity with power outages almost all the time? Or sort of expensive electricity and a very stable grid? Well, for us gringos and expats, whose expenditure for an electric bill is a tiny percentage of our income or our pensions or whatever, all of us would rather have privatized electricity, which you pay a little more for, to have it steady and the grid solid. But ask a middle class, lower middle class, or even poor Latino the same question. You know what they'll tell you? Almost everyone will say they want the cheap electricity. Because you see, they're so used to having those power outages that it's become a kind of a way of life to them. Life goes on, they cope, and they rarely seem to be bothered by it. But to us first world gringos and expats, man, if the power goes out for 2 minutes, you're like, what the f***? But you have to remember, middle class, lower middle class, and poor Latinos pay a much greater percentage of their income for electricity than gringos and expats ever will. So for them, it's about the money, and for us, it's about the convenience. Which is why all the poor and middle class people will take to the streets and start picketing in the government square when the word gets out that the government's thinking about selling the electric company or even the water company to a private entity. When that stuff happens, it means only 2 things to the average Latino. The price of electric or water is going to go up. And 2, there'll be a big loss of jobs because once private companies move in, they immediately start weeding out the dead weight, which immediately puts a lot of lard-ass, no-good-for-nothing, redundant workers out on the street. But it is true when a private company buys into a government utility or partners up with a government utility, price to the consumer always goes up. That's because they have to go in and modernize a terribly old and creaky infrastructure. But back to Davy's email. He says, Johnny, is there a simple calculation that could deduce the battery power reservoir needed for a home energy system that's completely off the grid so that you can install a system that'll power up your house for 24 or 48 hours if there's no sun, it's raining, or whatever? Yes, Davy, that's easy. But you have to remember, if you're living up in the States, you're certainly using at least twice as many kilowatt hours per month or day as you would be using if you were living in Latin America. That's true even if you're living on or near the beach and using air conditioning quite a bit. So here's how you do the calculation. You grab your electric bill. Check out the kilowatt hour reading for the most recent month. It might be, for example, 600. Then they'll have a history going back for 5 months so you can see how it compares to your past usage. So let's say the last couple of months average out to 600 kilowatts per month. You divide 600 by 30 days in the month to get what your kilowatt hour usage is per day. Now remember, we're talking about a whole house solar system now, not a portable one. Anyway, that number comes out to 20 kilowatt hours a day. That would mean if for a whole day you didn't have power or sun, it was raining like crazy, let's say, meaning even if you had solar panels, they wouldn't be charging your system. You'd have to rely totally on the battery. So you'll need to have a big enough battery that stored enough energy to last a day, 20 kilowatts. Now that's a lot of battery. That would be like having 2 Tesla Powerwalls. Actually, 2 Tesla Powerwalls would give you about 25 kilowatts because each one of those will store about 12 to 14 kilowatts. And as you heard me mention on a past show, those Tesla Powerwalls are not cheap. Going to cost you 10 to 12 grand to have one of those things installed, so you need 2 of them, and now you're well over 20 grand. However, if you're living down here in Latin America, automatically your electric power usage is about half, maybe less. That means 1 Tesla Powerwall. Better yet, you could go with one of the all-in-one solar power systems like a Powerwall, only it's not a brand name, but has all the same components inside. You could buy yourself a 12 kilowatt unit, all included within the package, for about 6 grand or so. Then, of course, you'll need the panels. I always recommend around 5,000 total watts worth of panels on your roof. That would be around 15 300-watt panels. You should be able to pick those things up locally on OLX.com for 2 or 3 grand. And installation, well, that's easy. You can get some buddies together and do it if you're do-it-yourselfer type, or you can hire someone to do it. It might cost you $1,500 to have someone install it. In any event, here in Latin America, you can easily buy a complete off-the-grid solar system for 10 grand more or less and never have another electric bill again. Even better, the solar panels are these days guaranteed 25 years. That is, they're guaranteed 25 years not to degrade more than 80% of their initial value. And those big battery pack all-inclusive units are usually guaranteed for the electronics around 5 years. The lithium-ion batteries, depending on the company, will either give you a 5 or 10-year guarantee or a certain amount of life cycles or recharge cycles, usually around 3,000. What that means is they're saying you can charge and discharge the batteries all the way down to 20%, 3,000 times. And let me tell you, that's big time overkill. Because, there might be days here and there you discharge your battery quite a bit when there's no sun and it's raining, etc. But the vast majority of days you'll have plenty of sun in your solar panels, so the batteries will only discharge down to maybe 50% or 60%. So you can pretty much guarantee your battery pack will last 20 years. But then again, within 2, 3, or even 5 years, batteries will be half the price and half the size once again. So whatever happens, you're prepared and ready for anything now. And in the future, you won't be in for sticker shock when your batteries finally do degrade. In fact, I think people put too much stock in these solar guarantees because by the time something runs out of guarantee or warranty, it's going to be a completely new world and a completely new ballgame. So you should definitely look for good long guarantees. But it's a fact simply by looking at Moore's Law that if your system poops out in 10 years and you were expecting it to last 20, in a way you might be glad it pooped out because things will be so much smaller, cheaper, and efficient. Your system might look like today's equivalent of an old antique Edsel. But then again, as long as it performs, right? So bottom line, my suggestion, by all means, go completely solar off the grid if you can. And considering that, there are only 2 things that could stop you from doing so. One is you rent and you don't own. Oh, of course, your landlord would love it if you solarized the house, but hey, it's not your house. Number 2, you could be a homeowner, but you just don't have the dough. And personally, I'm against financing anything, even solar. Really, what's the point? But that's just me. In any case, whether you rent or own, have dough or not, you should get a portable solar system as soon as you can. And get a good one. There are lots of them out there, but only a few that I'd personally recommend. Same thing with portable suitcase solar panels too. There are tons of them out there. Look on Amazon. There's so many, it's confusing. But just shoot me an email and I'll give you my list. In fact, I just had 2 more suitcase solar panels, 200 watts each, delivered by UPS about an hour ago. And I'm looking at my nice little portable unit right in the corner here now. I've been testing it, and man, I'm more than satisfied with that thing. My cost, well, I get them right from the factory in China. $650 for the little unit, a 1200 watt job with lithium batteries and all in one unit, weighs around 25 pounds. And the suitcase solar panels with their own carrying case, each is rated at 200 watts, the perfect setup. And the cost, again, directly from China, around $225 each. Even on Amazon, 200 watt suitcase panels are more than twice that price. Though if you order direct from the factory in China, you'll pay for shipping. So let's say you order exactly what I have. The solar power unit, $650, 2 solar panels, $225 each, just a little over $1,000, right? But the shipping and possible import taxes, depending where you are, could be another $500. Total cost $1,500. But there are some very similar units on Amazon. But the unit itself without solar panels, $1,500. I think all in all, I've got one of the best portable systems you can get. And for a much lower price than you can do yourself by cobbling pieces together from Amazon. But still, you're looking at $1,500. All right, enough said about that. But now I'd like to mention a little travel conundrum. You know, I've been to 100 countries now. I think I've seen and used every model and make of toilet in existence. But there's this thing about some of the modern lowboy toilets. They have a flush button that's kind of 2-in-1. Have you noticed that? It's not symmetrical. On the right side, it's smaller, and the left side, it's larger. What's up with that? Well, I'll tell you, I don't think 1 in 10,000 people knows what it's for. But if you look it up, you'll find out. The small button on the right is for a quick flush, and the button on the left for a long flush. Yeah, right, like who's measuring? That's a pretty subjective thing we're talking about, huh? I suppose a lot of it depends on the quantity of street food and tacos in your system. Now, I ask you, who presses that eco-friendly button? I'm certainly in favor of the no turd left behind policy myself. Reminds me of those famous books I never read a long time ago, the Left Behind series. Anyway, I think in the face of these dual flush toilet mechanisms, it's another case of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Then again, those toilets have nothing on the toilets in the Middle East, except for in Israel and some of the nicer restaurants, hotels, and food franchises. In most Middle Eastern homes and businesses, it's just a hole in the floor or the wall. Ugh. All in all, just another hole in the...
South of the border.
You've been listening to the Expat Files, living in Latin America. If you need some help with your own plan B, we can schedule a one-on-one phone or Skype consult. Just send me an email, theexpatfiles@gmail.com. And if you want to get on the waiting list for my next week-long Expat Insider Seminar in Central America, where you're guaranteed to get a 2 to 5 year head start on your plan B, send me an email, theexpatfiles@gmail.com. Nos vemos.